Hi, my name is Veronica Thomas, and this is my presentation on 1920s women's fashion. A brief lesson. Moving on, there were several factors that affected fashion in the 1920s. So many things, such as the First World War had ended 2 years before. This caused women to be in the workforce significantly more and caused several of them to have jobs that many of them did not want to let go of after the war ended. Also, the 19th Amendment was enacted, giving white women the right to vote, which also helped usher in a new age of feminism. And also, the Jazz Age was enacted, Prohibition was enacted, consumerism was at its peak. It was a generally optimistic time in which speakeasies were around. And those speakeasies were also jazz clubs in which you could get alcohol on the down low. This caused a whole party look to be almost in need, and that is what we know as the flapper look, many of us may know as. Even though not everyone really dressed in this whole flapper look, its effects on fashion were huge. Almost everything was touched by this look. Such as shoes. Instead of more practical things, high heels, even though they're not just super high comparatively to modern fashion, high heels and little strappy things on shoes were literally almost the only type of shoe you could find in the 1920s, as you can see here. It was just between fancier shoes and more casual shoes, there was heels on everything. I have even seen a 1920s tennis shoe with a little bit of heel on it. They put heels on everything because that almost party look influenced even what you might say the common man's fashion. Moving on, hats were very popular during the time, especially, I think I'm pronouncing this right, the cloche hat. The cloche hat was almost like a weird upside down bucket, usually with a little flare at the end, that was decorated with various items, but the main point was it accentuated the bob that was extremely popular at the time and was just the most popular hat of the 1920s. But it's not the only hat. There were so many other kinds of hats in the 1920s. As I said, they were a popular fashion piece at the time. There was wide brimmed, as you can see over here, wide brimmed hats, almost like sun hats. There was similar items to the cloche hat, but not exactly. And there was also just these frilly things that people would put. I mean, it was just a time for consumerism, a time for excess. It was not necessary by any means, but people liked it. And that brought in several new fashions for the time. Moving on, the hemline, I'm not sure if I said it before, but the hemline rose dramatically. Both of these magazines were from the 1920s. Before the 1920s, the hemline was like ankles and below, okay? It was low. But during the peak of how high the hemline got during the 1920s, it was just above the knee. Now, that is dramatic change for a whole decade, especially back then. This new look was brought on by especially young women wanting to defy the almost Victorian values of their parents, in the sense that they were not what society viewed a woman should be. They weren't virtuous. They went out, they partied, they smoked, they drank. Several of them were promiscuous with other young men. They went to the speakeasies and they danced, and that specifically the dancing is also what brought on this new silhouette. Corsets were abandoned for much more comfortable, more free undergarments, and a waistline was just very straight and slim, and the hemline was high, so it was more free to move and dance in these dresses, but several of them were still had low necklines and were fancy and flashy. But as you can see to the left, while that did have an influence, and these fashions are clearly not traditional in the sense that no corsets are there or anything, it's still more modest than, as you can see to the right. So there were young women who were known as flappers, and were the party girls, but there was also just your average everyday mothers, daughters. There was other women who didn't wear exactly the flapper look, but as you can see, it had its influences everywhere. And I was saying, not every woman dressed like that. Even though it was a new age for feminism, it was still the 1920s. Most working women still worked women's jobs, such as secretary or, whatchamacallit, assistant. I lost my word there. Secretary or assistant, and several of them, even though women were starting to work more in political parties, they would deal with like women's issues or what people labeled as women's issues. And while this wasn't great, many women at the time still saw it as progress because it was progress. And I think that concludes my presentation, my short presentation on 1920s women's fashion. And you can see that was my works cited. Wait, has it not been recording? Oh, wait, no, it has.